6:53 hours. May 21, 1945. Southern Okinawa, just west of the Shuri Line. PFC Daniel Hayes, age 21, United States Marine Corps, lay pressed into a shallow shell scrape that had not existed 2 hours earlier. A mortar round had dug it for him at 5:11, throwing mud and coral fragments across the slope. Now the hole was his only cover on a bare, rising saddle of ground that ran 180 meters up toward a low ridge bristling with Japanese bunkers. On his back, the M2 Flamethrower weighed close to 30 kilograms loaded, twin cylindrical tanks and a central nitrogen bottle rising above his shoulders like a metal target. Marines in his company called it the kettle. The more honest ones, the ones who had watched other men burn or explode, called it what the platoon sergeant had muttered at 6:07 that morning: suicide gear. At 6:53, that suicide gear was the only thing anyone in F Company believed might break the 4 concrete bunkers that had stopped them twice in the last 24 hours. A burst of 7.7 mm machine gun fire snapped overhead, stitching the crest of the shell scrape. Hayes felt chips of coral sting the back of his neck. The Japanese gun was 90 meters ahead and 10 meters above him, firing from a squat, rectangular opening barely wider than a helmet. He checked his watch. The crystal was scratched from Cape Gloucester, but the hand still held. 6:54. The battalion order said the main assault up this slope would start at 9 o'clock. He had 2 hours and 6 minutes to stay alive and get ready. 3 months earlier, at 14:20 on February 10, 1945, the air at Camp Pendleton had smelled of dust and burnt gasoline as Hayes met the M2 for the first time. He had been a rifleman in 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines since 1943. He carried an M1 Garand, .30-06, 8-round end-block clips, 10.7 pounds loaded. He knew its feel and recoil. Then the platoon commander had called for volunteers for its special weapon course. Only 3 men stepped forward at 14:22. The rest stayed in the line. Everyone had seen the pictures from Saipan and Tinian, men in silhouetted photographs, tanks on their backs, throwing streams of fire into dark cave mouths. The instructor from Division Weapons Company, a staff sergeant with Guadalcanal and New Britain on his ribbon bar, rolled an M2 onto the packed dirt at 14:31. "This is the M2-2 portable flamethrower," he said. 68 pounds full, depending on your mix. 2 fuel tanks. 1 compressed nitrogen cylinder. 20 to 40 yards effective range if the wind doesn't hate you. He slapped the steel frame. Average life of an operator in combat? Depends whether you're stupid or just unlucky. The Japs see these tanks, they shoot at you first. He made them repeat the safety rules. Never fire with a kinked hose. Check the nitrogen pressure. 2000 psi was ideal. Keep the igniter assembly clean. Twin spark plugs, powered by a 6-volt dry cell battery, sitting in the nozzle head. Flame on demand depended on those 2 points of ignition. If they failed, the weapon became a hose spraying raw fuel. At 15:07, they took turns strapping the harness on. The loaded unit weighed nearly half of Hayes's own body weight. The metal pressed into his shoulders and the frame dug into his lower back. "Feels like I'm the one being carried," he muttered. The staff sergeant heard him. "Get used to it, kid. This thing makes you the most hated man on the battlefield, on both sides. Your own people will expect miracles from you. The enemy will try to kill you just for standing up." At 15:19, they stepped to the firing line. A row of sand-filled oil drums sat 25 meters out. "Short bursts," the instructor said. 3 seconds max. Each tank only gives you around 70 seconds of total flame if you go continuous. You run dry, you're just a walking bomb without the punch. At 15:23, Hayes squeezed the trigger for the first time. The jet of thickened gasoline shot out with a noise like a giant blowtorch, a throbbing roar in his chest and teeth. The stream hit the first drum and wrapped it in orange flame. He felt the heat on his face even through the stiff Marine Corps issue goggles. When the course ended on February 24 at 16:45, only 2 of the 3 volunteers were still in the program. 1 man had dropped out with a stress fracture from carrying the weight. The battalion kept both remaining operators. At 17:10, The platoon began calling the M2 suicide gear, behind the instructors' backs. The name stuck. Okinawa came next. On April 1, 1945, L-Day, Hayes was still on a transport offshore, watching the sky flash over the island as battleships and cruisers pounded the shoreline. 7th Marines, 1st Marines, and 6th Marines went in first. By 10 o'clock the reports coming back said the landings were lightly opposed. By April 20th, that phrase was a grim joke. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, had pulled back, avoiding the beaches. They were dug into the southern hills instead, in layered defenses of concrete bunkers, tunnels, and interlocking machine gun nests. The Shuri Line. On May 12 at 8:30, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, received orders to attack west of Shuri, towards a nameless ridge the maps only marked with contour lines and grid references. By May 20th, the battalion had advanced less than a kilometer. They'd lost more than 100 men. The 4 bunkers that mattered now sat along the forward face of that ridge, each one about 40 meters apart, positioned to cover the others. They had thick reinforced concrete walls, roughly 1.5 meters thick at the front, with embrasures only 30 centimeters tall and perhaps 1 meter wide. Inside, Japanese machine guns of 7.7 millimeters caliber swept the slope with grazing fire. The approach was a shallow bowl with almost no natural cover. Any movement was visible from the bunker's firing ports. Twice already, on May 20th at 9 o'clock and again at 15:40, F Company had tried frontal assaults. Each time, the men barely made it 50 meters uphill before mortar fire and machine guns pinned them to the ground. By 16:10 on the 20th, 6 Marines in Hayes's platoon were dead or evacuated with leg and chest wounds. At 18:05 that evening, the company commander called his NCOs and specialists together in a blown-out farmhouse 300 meters behind the line. The walls were sandbagged up to chest height, and the beams above were blackened from a fire that had burned itself out days before. "Those 4 bunkers are the cork in this bottle," the captain said, tapping a mud-stained map. "Regiment wants them gone by tomorrow afternoon. Tanks haven't been able to get up that slope. Too exposed. Mortars aren't doing it. That means you, flamethrowers and demo men." He looked at Hayes and at Corporal Joe Ramirez, the other flamethrower operator in the company. "At 9 o'clock tomorrow, we put down smoke. Tanks will move up as far as they can. Hayes, you'll go with 2nd Platoon on the right. Ramirez, you'll go with 1st Platoon on the left. Your job is to blind and burn those bunkers, one by one, while the rifle squads close in with satchel charges." The room fell quiet at 18:11. The only sound was artillery in the distance. "Questions?" the captain asked. None of them said what they were thinking, that flamethrower operators had life expectancy measured in minutes once a fight like that started. At 18:19, as they stepped back into the evening light, Sergeant Keegan clapped Hayes on the shoulder harness of the M2. "You're carrying suicide gear, kid," the sergeant said quietly. "But it's suicide for them if you can get close." Back on the slope at 6:58 on May 21st, the sun had already burned through the low clouds. The humidity pressed down like another piece of gear. Hayes drove his elbows into the dirt to lift some weight off the harness frame digging into his spine. He checked the M2's valves by feel. The central nitrogen cylinder sat between the twin fuel tanks. The pressure gauge, if it hadn't been cracked, should read around 2,000 psi. The fuel tanks, each holding about 2.8 gallons of thickened gasoline mixture, had been topped off at 540. He had, by conservative estimate, maybe 65 seconds of total flame, spread across as many bursts as he dared. At 7:03, artillery from the division's 11th Marines began softening the ridge again. 105mm shells came in at 10-second intervals, walking up and down the slope and over the crest. The concussion rolled over the shell scrape, sending dust into his teeth and ears. "Wish they'd just bury the bastards," the private next to him muttered, hugging his M1. "They're deeper than that," Hayes said. "We're the shovel." At 7:27, a runner slid into the scrape with orders. 2nd Platoon was to shift 20 meters right to avoid a suspected minefield. Hayes and his assistant, PFC Miller, A quiet kid from Ohio whose job was to carry spare fuel and to help spot targets, crawled with them, dragging and pushing the heavy rig across the broken ground. The tanks scraped on coral. Every clank felt loud enough to draw fire. At 7:39, a Japanese mortar round fell short, exploding 30 meters upslope. The shock waves slapped the earth. A fragment hit Miller's helmet with a sharp metallic crack and ricocheted. He flinched but didn't move. "You good?" Hayes asked. Miller touched the helmet, checked his fingers for blood, then nodded. "Yeah. Just ringing." At 7:55, the company radio crackled with a fire mission adjustment. The battalion command post, 800 meters to the rear, was coordinating smoke and high explosive for the 9 o'clock attack. The plan, starting at 8:55, 81mm mortars would lay smoke across the bunker line for 4 minutes. At 8:59, 2 Sherman tanks from the battalion's attached tank platoon would edge forward on the left axis, firing 75mm high-explosive shells at the embrasures. H-hour, 9 o'clock, 2nd Platoon, with Hayes, would rush the right side under cover of smoke and tank fire. At 8:02, the captain crawled down the irregular line of shell scrapes, his map case banging against his thigh. He stopped at Hayes's position at 8:05, took a quick look uphill, then back at the young Marine with the tanks on his back. "You see the rightmost bunker?" he asked, pointing with 2 fingers just above the crest of the shallow hole. Hayes raised his head an inch, just enough to look through the heat shimmer. The bunker sat partly buried into the slope, an angular shadow in the side of the hill, maybe 90 meters away. The embrasure was just a black rectangle at this distance. "Yes, sir." "That's your first target," the captain said. "You get within 25-30 yards, you open up, drown that opening. Short bursts. Once it's suppressed, 2nd Squad will close in with charges. After that, you pivot left, move to Bunker 2. We repeat." "4 positions total, sir?" Hayes asked. They had counted them last night at 1940 using binoculars and sunset light. "For that we can see," the captain said. "There may be more. Just do the first 4. You don't have to win the entire Pacific today." He checked his watch. 8:06. Just be ready at 8:55. You move when the smoke drops. Don't wait for the perfect moment. There won't be one. At 8:18, F Company's corpsmen went down the line, rechecking bandages, morphine syrettes, and tourniquets. Hayes noted where each of them paused. He had seen enough dead men since Cape Gloucester to know that whoever went uphill with him, some would not be coming back. At 8:33, the platoon sergeant crawled over with a loop of extra hose slung around his shoulder. "Miller will carry this behind you," he said. "If your main line gets cut, you can patch it if you're quick." "You really expect me to do field repairs under fire, Sarge?" Hayes asked, trying to keep his voice flat. "I expect you to improvise if you gotta," the sergeant replied. "You've done the drills. Remember, you own that weapon. It doesn't own you. Use cover. Pick your moments." He shifted his weight, then lowered his voice. "And if the tanks can't get up, it'll just be you and the smoke. You still go." At 8:41, word came down the line that Ramirez, the other flamethrower operator, had been hit by a shell fragment while repositioning left. The fragment had torn into his thigh at 8:36. He was out, bleeding but alive, already being dragged back on a poncho. That left Hayes as the only operational flamethrower in the company. At 8:44, Hayes turned onto his knees enough to let the M2's weight settle properly on his shoulders. He checked the igniter switch on the wand, safe, for now, and wiped dust from the nozzle's twin spark plug ports with a gloved thumb. He thought briefly of sending a note to his parents. But there was no paper, and no time. The thought passed. At 8:49, the artillery shifted again, walking its pattern further behind the Japanese line to keep their reserves heads down. The last 105mm shell meant for the forward slopes burst at 8:51. The battlefield went strangely quiet for a moment, all of them waiting for what they knew was next. At 8:54, the first 81mm mortar smoke rounds began to fall. They popped and billowed, thick white clouds spilling across the ridge, blown sideways by the intermittent breeze. Visibility dropped. The bunkers flickered in and out, silhouettes in gray. 2 minutes! The platoon sergeant shouted at 8:58, his voice strained but steady. Check your gear. M1s clacked as men chambered rounds. Bar gunners checked their magazines. Satchel charges were unrolled and fuses inspected. Hayes flipped the igniter toggle on the wand to arm at 8 hours 59 minutes and 10 seconds. He felt the tiny click under his thumb. Somewhere in the wand, a circuit closed, ready to send battery power to the plugs. At 8 hours 59 minutes and 35 seconds, the Shermans on the left barked. Their 75mm guns hammered the slope, shells slamming into the smoke where map coordinates said the bunker's firing ports were. The air shook. At 8 hours 59 minutes and 50 seconds, with 10 seconds left before H hour, Hayes heard the platoon sergeant's last command, low and hard. On your feet, Marines. This is it. Hayes drew a slow breath. The M2's harness creaked as he shifted his weight forward, boots finding purchase in the loose coral. His heart pounded in his ears, almost louder than the tank guns. The men around him looked, for a moment, at the twin fuel tanks rising above his shoulders. Suicide gear. At 9 o'clock, he rose from the shell scrape into the drifting smoke, wand in his hands, and started up the slope toward the first bunker. 9 hours and 7 seconds. May 21st, 1945. Southern Okinawa. Hayes cleared the lip of the shell scrape and stepped into a world of drifting white smoke and concussive noise. The M2 shifted on his back with every stride. The frame dug into his shoulders, reminding him that one bad hit could turn him into a fireball. Second platoon surged forward with him, low and fast, spread across a front of about 40 meters. The slope rose at roughly a 15-degree angle, broken by shallow craters and scattered chunks of coral. Visibility through the smoke varied, sometimes no more than 10 meters, sometimes enough to catch a glimpse of the ridge line and the dark rectangles of the bunkers. At 9 hours and 21 seconds, he heard the first enemy reply. A burst of 7.7mm tracers lashed out from the rightmost bunker, red-orange streaks cutting through the haze a few meters above the ground. The gun had elevation set for knee height at 100 meters. They were still just outside that line. Down! Someone yelled at 9 hours and 24 seconds. Hayes dropped to one knee instead, keeping his shoulders high enough that the fuel tanks didn't hit a rock and throw him off balance. The M2 hose snaked along his left arm. The wand, about 4 feet long with its distinctive nozzle head, pointed up slope. He looked at his watch as he moved forward again. 9 hours and 31 seconds. The plan said he needed to be within 25 to 30 yards of the first bunker's embrasure. Any farther and the flame would diffuse, lose heat, and be vulnerable to crosswinds. Any closer and he'd be in the deadliest zone, where enemy grenades and small arms fire could find him with ease. At 9 hours and 47 seconds, a 75mm shell from one of the Shermans detonated just to the left of the rightmost bunker, a dirty flash in the smoke. Concrete chips, dirt, and rocks spalled out. The Japanese machine gun stuttered, paused, then started again, slightly slower. They hadn't knocked it out, just rattled it. At 9 hours 1 minute and 2 seconds, Hayes reached a shallow shell hole perhaps 60 meters from the bunker line. He slid into it, chest heaving. The extra weight of the M2 made every stride feel like two. Miller dropped in beside him, the coil of spare hose looped over his shoulder, an M1 carbine in his hands. How far? Miller shouted over the noise at 9 hours 1 minute and 8 seconds. Maybe 60 meters. Hayes replied. Need to get to 25. He risked a look up. Through a thinning gap in the smoke, he could see the rightmost bunker more clearly now. It sat like a squat concrete tooth in the side of the hill, its front face angled slightly to their right to give better fields of fire across the slope. The firing slit held the deep shadow of a gun barrel. At 9 hours 1 minute and 19 seconds, a mortar round cracked overhead and dropped behind them, exploding somewhere near the company's old line. The Japanese were adjusting. The platoon sergeant's voice carried from a few meters away at 9 hours 1 minute and 24 seconds. Second squad, push up with Hayes. Get him to that bunker. 3 riflemen, led by Corporal Jensen, moved into the shell hole and beyond it, fanning out to form a loose, moving screen around the flamethrower. Their job was simple and brutal. Draw some of the fire that would otherwise focus entirely on the man with the tanks. At 9 hours 1 minute and 41 seconds, Hayes clambered out of the shell hole and resumed the advance. He hunched instinctively, trying to make himself smaller even though the tanks rose above his head. He kept the wand low, muzzle slightly depressed, finger resting on the trigger but not squeezing. They closed the distance yard by yard. At 9 hours 1 minute and 57 seconds, the smoke thinned again for a moment, and the machine gun crew in the bunker saw them. A fresh burst tore out of the embrasure, horizontal, tight, disciplined. Tracers snapped close. One round hit Jensen high in the shoulder at 9 hours 2 minutes and 2 seconds, spinning him sideways into the dirt. He screamed once, then crawled, dragging himself downslope. Miller fired a quick 3-shot burst with the carbine, more to make the gun crew flinch than to hit anything. Another rifleman lobbed a grenade uphill at 9 hours 2 minutes and 9 seconds, but it rolled short and exploded uselessly, sending fragments into the slope. 30 meters! Hayes shouted at 9 hours 2 minutes and 16 seconds, judging the distance by instinct and training. I'm going! He dropped to one knee, planted his boots, and leveled the wand at the firing slit. The igniter switch was already armed. The nitrogen cylinder was live. He thumbed the firing trigger at 9 hours 2 minutes and 21 seconds. The M2 answered with a heavy metallic cough as pressurized nitrogen slammed into the fuel tanks. Then the hose flexed, and a thick, rope-like stream of burning fuel erupted from the nozzle. At this range, it moved like a living thing, a bright, orange-white tongue of flame extending out in an arc. The twin spark plugs at the nozzle tip did their job. The mix ignited completely, turning the stream into a coherent beam of fire reaching out approximately 30 yards. He swept the slit in a tight lateral motion, counting in his head. 1, 2, 3. At 9 hours 2 minutes and 25 seconds, he released the trigger. Short burst. Maybe 3 seconds. The fuel gauge in his head ticked down. He'd used around 5% of his total capacity. The bunker's firing port vanished behind a billowing blast of fire and black smoke. Burning fuel clung to the edges of the concrete. Some of it jetted inward, drawn by overpressure. The machine gun stutter cut off mid-burst. Again! Miller shouted at 9 hours 2 minutes and 28 seconds. Hayes waited just a heartbeat, watching for any movement in the slit. Then, at 9 hours 2 minutes and 31 seconds, he squeezed the trigger again. Another blast of flame roared out, driving straight into the opening. The heat washed back, even at 25 meters. He could feel it on his face, through the thin, sweat-soaked fabric of his uniform. Inside the bunker, the Japanese crew would be facing an impossible situation. Oxygen being eaten up, heat spiking, burning fuel streaming across their gun and bodies. Even if they survived the first burst, the second one made the position untenable. At 9 hours 2 minutes and 35 seconds, he cut off the flame, this time after just 2 seconds. He had to think beyond one bunker. There were 3 more. Second squad, move! The platoon sergeant yelled at 9 hours 2 minutes and 38 seconds. 2 Marines with satchel charges, canvas bags filled with blocks of TNT, each weighing about 20 pounds, rushed forward from behind. They reached the now smoking bunker face at 9 hours 2 minutes and 51 seconds, hunched low, rifles slung. At 9 hours 2 minutes and 56 seconds, one of them slapped a satchel against the right edge of the firing slit, shoved a short fuse into the detonator, and lit it with a scratch lighter. They dove back down the slope at 9 hours 3 minutes and 2 seconds. Down! Someone roared. Hayes hit the dirt at 9 hours 3 minutes and 5 seconds. The blast came at 9 hours 3 minutes and 8 seconds, a flat crack against the concrete. Part of the bunker's outer edge crumbled. Flame and smoke belched from the opening, followed by a scrap of what looked like cloth. The rightmost bunker was effectively dead. 9 hours 3 minutes and 13 seconds. Hayes pushed to his knees, feeling the weight of the tanks again, and turned his body left to bring the wand toward the second bunker. It sat maybe 40 meters further along the line, slightly higher, angled to rake the center of the slope. Time! He shouted to Miller. 9:03. Miller yelled back, rounding down, adrenaline distorting seconds. They had started at 9 o'clock. One bunker down in roughly 3 minutes. 3 to go. The second bunker had already opened fire on the center of the platoon's advance. At 9 hours 3 minutes and 22 seconds, its machine gun cut down a Marine who had stood to sprint toward cover. The man collapsed halfway up the slope, legs still kicking for a few seconds. The smoke from the mortar rounds was thinning as the barrage timed out. By 9 hours 3 minutes and 30 seconds, there were wider gaps, clear lines of sight both ways. Hayes knew this was the most dangerous window, too far to be on top of his target, close enough that the Japanese could see his silhouette and the glint of steel tanks on his back. He moved anyway. At 9 hours 3 minutes and 37 seconds, he broke left at a diagonal, trying to approach the second bunker from an off-axis angle. If he came in directly uphill, the gun would have a straight shot at him. If he angled in from the right, hugging what little defilade the terrain offered, he could close the distance before appearing fully in the embrasure's cone of fire. He hustled, boots slipping twice. The M2's frame bounced. The hose dragged over a jag of coral and snagged at 9 hours 3 minutes and 52 seconds. Miller saw the snag first. He dropped, freed the line with a yank and shouted, "Clear!" At 9 hours 4 minutes and 1 second, Hayes dove into another shallow depression, maybe 35 meters from the second bunker. From here, the firing slit was almost level with his eyes. He checked his mental fuel gauge. He'd used perhaps 10 seconds total so far, out of roughly 65. He could afford a heavier burst on this one if needed. At 9 hours 4 minutes and 9 seconds, the second bunker's gun swung toward their sector. The shift in tracer pattern told him they had been spotted. Rounds cracked into the dirt just ahead of his position. He didn't wait. At 9 hours 4 minutes and 13 seconds, he rose to a half-kneel, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The jet of burning fuel leapt from the nozzle, directly toward the slit. This time, he held it longer. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 9 hours 4 minutes and 17 seconds, he cut off. The stream had hit the opening clean, splashing into the interior. Flames licked out. The machine gun faltered. He shifted the wand slightly and fired again at 9 hours 4 minutes and 21 seconds, shorter this time. 2 seconds. He aimed low, trying to drive fire deeper into the bunker's floor and gun pit. At 9 hours 4 minutes and 24 seconds, a lone Japanese soldier burst from a side entrance, perhaps 10 meters to the left of the bunker, carrying what looked like a satchel charge on a cord. He ran downhill, angling toward Hayes, intent on closing the distance and detonating it within range of the fuel tanks. Miller saw him first and fired 3 rapid shots at 9 hours 4 minutes and 27 seconds. The first 2 missed. The third hit the man in the chest. The satchel dropped. The Japanese soldier stumbled but kept moving, one hand clamped to his wound. At 9 hours 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Hayes swung the wand, almost by reflex, and sent a 1-second burst of flame toward the charging figure. The jet engulfed the man, and the satchel detonated a split second later, a burst of black and orange. The concussion knocked Hayes back on his heels. His ears rang. Dust and bits of burned cloth pattered down. At 9 hours 4 minutes and 37 seconds, he shook his head, recentered the wand, and fired one more short burst into the second bunker slit for insurance. Inside, whatever had been moving stopped. "Charges up!" someone yelled at 9 hours 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Again, Marines rushed forward with satchels. At 9 hours 4 minutes and 56 seconds, another heavy bang signaled the second bunker's destruction. Hayes's watch hand crept toward 9:05. 2 bunkers neutralized in roughly 5 minutes. His lungs burned. His shoulders ached under the straps. Sweat ran down his back under the canvas and steel. "Third bunker!" The platoon sergeant pointed with the barrel of his carbine at 9 hours 5 minutes and 12 seconds. The third position was further left, maybe 50 meters away, and slightly recessed into a fold of the hillside. It had been quieter so far, probably holding fire until the other positions either pinned or failed. Now it opened up. At 9 hours 5 minutes and 19 seconds, a diagonal stream of tracers swept the middle of the company's line, catching a bar gunner and knocking him flat. The gun's field of fire overlapped with what was left of the fourth bunker's, creating a lethal crossfire. The tanks on the left tried to engage. At 9 hours 5 minutes and 29 seconds, one Sherman fired, sending a 75mm round toward the approximate location of the third bunker. The shell impacted high, above the crest, showering dirt but leaving the gun intact. "Smoke's gone," Miller shouted at 9 hours 5 minutes and 33 seconds. The last of the mortar haze had burned off. The fight now was in clear daylight. Hayes realized that from the Japanese perspective, he must look like a walking bullseye. Two tall cylinders, shiny in spots where the paint had chipped, silhouetted against the sky each time he climbed a small rise. If he stopped, they would zero in. If he moved, he might make it before they did. He moved. At 9 hours 5 minutes and 41 seconds, he sprinted left and upward, cutting across a diagonal, trying to stay low in the contour. Bullets snapped overhead. One hit the edge of the nozzle at 9 hours 5 minutes and 47 seconds, ricocheting with a metallic ping but not penetrating. If that round had been a few inches back, it might have punctured a fuel tank. He felt nothing but the surge of adrenaline. At 9 hours 5 minutes and 55 seconds, he slid behind a jagged chunk of coral about waist-high and risked a quick look. The third bunker slit was visible, about 30 meters away, slightly above him, angled to his right. Good angle for him, too. He could rake the inside from this side if he had a clear shot. "Covering fire!" he shouted at 9 hours 6 minutes and 2 seconds. Second platoon answered. M1s cracked along the line. Bars chattered. They weren't going to punch rounds through concrete, but they could make anyone leaning into that firing port duck. At 9 hours 6 minutes and 9 seconds, he rose, aimed, and fired. The fuel shot out, caught the lip of the slit, and spilled inward. A tongue of fire curled out immediately, followed by the muffled hump of something inside catching. Maybe ammunition, maybe stored fuel, maybe wooden framing. He counted 3 seconds, then cut off. At 9 hours 6 minutes and 14 seconds, he fired again, shorter. Flames rolled across the bunker's face and rose from a vent hole near the roofline. By 9 hours 6 minutes and 21 seconds, the machine gun in the third bunker was silent. Satchel charges finished the job at 9 hours 6 minutes and 38 seconds. Another flat, hard blast. The front edge of the bunker sagged. 3 bunkers down. 9 hours 6 minutes and 45 seconds. Hayes felt the fatigue now like lead poured into his muscles. His breaths came hard. The M2 felt heavier than when he'd started. He had used perhaps 40 seconds of total flame. That left a little more than 20. The fourth bunker sat slightly behind the line of the other 3, offset to the rear by about 15 meters. It had been firing intermittently, conserving ammunition, waiting for targets of opportunity. At 9 hours 6 minutes and 59 seconds, it found one. A Marine carrying a satchel charge on the far left took a burst in the back and fell, the canvas bag rolling away. The platoon sergeant swore, then looked at Hayes. "You got enough juice for one more?" he shouted at 9 hours 7 minutes and 6 seconds. Hayes nodded, swallowed, and checked his grip on the wand. "Yes, Sarge. One more." The approach to the fourth bunker was the worst yet. The terrain between his position and the target was more exposed, with fewer depressions. The bunker had a wider field of fire and a clearer view of the slope. At 9 hours 7 minutes and 19 seconds, Hayes began moving in a broken zigzag, trying to make himself as unpredictable a target as possible. His legs felt like they were moving through water, every step dragging under the combined weight of the M2 and his combat load. The machine gun in the fourth bunker tracked him. Tracers walked up the slope, searching. A round hit the ground just in front of him at 9 hours 7 minutes and 26 seconds, kicking up a spray of coral. Another snapped past his left ear. Miller and 2 riflemen poured fire at the bunker, aiming at the slit, not with much hope of penetration but with volume and anger. At 9 hours 7 minutes and 34 seconds, Hayes reached a small, broken berm, maybe 20 centimeters high. He dropped behind it, more for the illusion of cover than actual protection, and checked the range. Roughly 28 to 30 meters. He knew he needed to be closer. At this range, the flame would reach, but with less density and less heat. The wind had picked up slightly from their right, pushing any jet a few degrees off target. At 9 hours 7 minutes and 42 seconds, he decided. He pushed up, hunched forward, and ran the last few meters, closing the distance to roughly 20 yards. His boots hammered the dirt. Time seemed to stretch. He could hear each breath rasp in his throat, feel each strap of the harness cut into his shoulders. At 9 hours 7 minutes and 51 seconds, he dropped to a knee, planted, and brought the wand up. The gun in the bunker fired again, but he was already committed. He squeezed the trigger at 9 hours 7 minutes and 54 seconds. The M2 spat a roaring stream of fire directly into the slit at near optimal range. The jet hit with full force, splashing against the interior and washing over whatever and whoever was inside. The heat blast rolled back like an open furnace door. He held it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 9 hours 7 minutes and 59 seconds, with his muscles trembling and the wand vibrating in his hands, he released. The interior of the bunker glowed orange, then darkened under boiling black smoke. He had perhaps 10 seconds of fuel left, enough for a final burst if needed. At 9 hours 8 minutes and 4 seconds, the bunker answered. Not with gunfire, but with a muffled explosion from within. Something stored there, grenades, ammunition, maybe a small stock of fuel, had cooked off. The front of the bunker belched smoke and flame. "Charges go!" the platoon sergeant yelled at 9 hours 8 minutes and 12 seconds. 2 Marines sprinted forward, low, carrying the remaining satchel. They slapped it against a side vent at 9 hours 8 minutes and 19 seconds, lit the fuse, and dove away. The blast at 9 hours 8 minutes and 24 seconds cracked the already damaged structure. A piece of the roofline collapsed inward. The fourth bunker was done. Hayes looked at his watch. 9:11. From the moment he'd risen out of the shell scrape at 9 o'clock to the collapse of the final bunker at 9:11, 11 minutes had passed. 11 minutes of sprinting, firing, and making decisions that meant life or death for the men around him. The fight on that slope did not end the war. It did not even end the battle for that sector. But it broke the cork. By 9:17, with the 4 key bunkers silenced, F Company pushed over the ridge line. They cleared shallow trenches and smaller fighting positions with grenades and rifle fire. Japanese resistance stiffened again on the reverse slope, but the worst of the interlocking machine gun fire was gone. At 10:03, Battalion reported the ridge taken. By 14:20 that afternoon, artillery observers had established positions on the high ground, directing fire deeper into the Shuri defenses. The map grid the bunkers had sat on, once a cluster of black symbols, was now just a scar on the hillside. That evening, at 19:30, in a makeshift command post dug into the reverse slope, the company commander called Hayes in. The young Marine looked smaller without the M2 on his back. His utility jacket was dark with sweat and streaked with soot. His hands shook slightly when he took the enamel mug of coffee someone passed him. "I've got reports from all 3 platoons," the captain said at 19:32. "They agree on one thing. Without you, we'd still be pinned below that ridge, or we'd be dead." Hayes stared at the floor for a moment. "Just did my job, sir," he said quietly. "You did more than that," the captain replied. "You took out 4 primary bunkers in what, 11 minutes? He looked at his notes. "Started at 9 o'clock, last one went up at 9:11. He set the paper down. "I'm putting you in for the Navy Cross," he said. "Maybe higher. Division will decide. But I want you to understand something. Today you carried what everyone called suicide gear, and you made it suicide for the enemy instead." Hayes did not answer. The words felt heavy, like metals pinned onto a jacket still soaked in other men's blood. At 20:05, he crawled into a shallow dugout with Miller and a few other survivors. He lay on his side, staring at the curve of the bunker roof silhouetted against the dark. When he closed his eyes, he saw flame spraying into narrow openings, heard the muffled screams and explosions inside. He slept in short bursts, waking twice from dreams of his tanks being hit. Okinawa dragged on. On May 29, 1945, the 1st Marine Division pushed further south, grinding forward hill by hill. Hayes carried the M2 on 3 more major assaults, though none matched the intensity of May 21st. Each time, he moved more cautiously, using every scrap of cover, conserving fuel, coordinating closely with rifle squads and tank crews. By June 21st, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa collapsed. The island was officially declared secure. On July 3 at 11:15, in a small ceremony near the division headquarters area, Hayes stood at attention as a general read the citation for his Navy Cross. The medal's blue and white ribbon lay stiff against his sunburned neck. The citation described his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, and noted the destruction of 4 mutually supporting enemy bunkers within 11 minutes under intense hostile fire. It mentioned his weapon by name, the M2 Flamethrower. Men in the crowd, some with fresh bandages, watched silently. The term suicide gear still slipped out in conversation, but now it carried a new angle. They had seen what could be done with it in the right hands. In August 1945, after the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender, units began rotating home. On October 4th, at 9:40, Hayes stepped off a transport ship onto a pier in San Diego. The air smelled of oil, salt, and a different kind of dust. He had time to think on the train ride home, moving east across fields and cities that had never heard a mortar round. At 17:21 evening, watching the sun set out the window somewhere in Kansas, he saw the reflection of his own face and, faintly, the ghost image of twin fuel tanks behind his shoulders. He blinked and they were gone. After the war, Hayes did not stay in uniform. In March 1946, at age 22, he enrolled in a small technical college in Ohio, using the new GI Bill. He studied mechanical engineering, drawn to systems, pressures, valves, the same things that had made the M2 deadly and temperamental. By 1950, he was working at a factory designing industrial burners and heating systems, technologies that use controlled flame for peaceful purposes. The irony was not lost on him. He rarely talked about Okinawa, but in 1952, the Marine Corps invited him back to Camp Pendleton as a guest instructor for a new generation of flamethrower operators. He spent 2 weeks there in July, walking young Marines through the same drills he had learned in 1945. He emphasized cover, coordination, and timing. "Your job is not to be a hero," he told them at 9:10 on a training morning. "Your job is to stay alive long enough to put fire where it needs to go, so your buddies can finish the job. You're not a lone wolf. You're part of a team." He explained in clear terms the technical facts: tank capacities, nitrogen pressures, ignition systems. He showed them how to inspect hoses for cracks, how to patch minor leaks, how to judge effective range by eye. But he also told them what it felt like to be the focus of every enemy gun. "When you stand up," he said, "remember that you are the first thing they'll shoot at. Plan your movement so you stand up where it does the most good and for the shortest time." Some of those lessons made their way into updated training manuals. Notes from his debriefings, conducted in late 1945 and again in 1952, helped refine doctrines on how flamethrowers should be used, always with covering fire, always in coordination with engineers carrying explosives, always as part of a combined arms push. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the role of man-portable flamethrowers began to shrink. New weapons, rockets, demolition charges, armored vehicles with better guns, took over some of their missions. The M2 itself was replaced by the M9 and then by more sophisticated systems. But on dusty classroom chalkboards and in field manuals, the lessons learned on Okinawa remained. Case studies of bunker assaults referenced a flamethrower operator in the 1st Marine Division who cleared 4 bunkers in 11 minutes under concentrated fire. His name might not always have been attached, but the story was there. In the 1980s, when historians began recording oral histories of World War II veterans in greater numbers, a young researcher from a Midwestern university sat with Hayes at his kitchen table at 13:30 on a quiet Saturday. The tape recorder clicked on. He spoke in measured terms, describing times, distances, and weapon models with the clarity of someone who had never forgotten them. He talked about the weight of the M2, the range of the flame, the limited fuel. He described the smell of burning concrete dust and coral. When the researcher asked what he thought about being called a hero, he shook his head. "I was a kid carrying a dangerous piece of equipment," he said at 13:47. "The boys around me made it possible for me to do anything useful with it. Without them drawing fire, without the satchel charges, without the tanks, I'd have just been a target. The researcher asked about the phrase, suicide gear. Had he heard it? He nodded. Sure, he said. We all called it that. Because that's what it looked like. Big tanks of flammable stuff on your back. No armor. But I learned something on that ridge. The gear is only suicide if you use it alone, without a plan. Once you make it part of a coordinated push, it becomes something else. It becomes a way through. In later years, his story appeared in a few books about the Pacific War, usually as a vignette in chapters on Okinawa or on specialized weapons. A small museum exhibit in a regional military history center eventually displayed an M2 flamethrower with a plaque describing the actions of PFC Daniel Hayes, USMC, and the 11 minutes on May 21, 1945, when 4 bunkers on a nameless ridge fell in rapid succession. Recruits and visitors would stand in front of the glass and stare at the twin tanks, the hose, the wand. Many of them would think the same phrase the Marines of 1945 had used. Suicide gear. If they read the plaque, they would see that, for at least one man on one hill, the story was more complicated. His legacy was not just the medal pinned to his uniform or the line in a citation. It was the change in how the weapon he carried was understood. Through his after-action reports and training input, flamethrower doctrine shifted from reckless frontal charges to carefully timed, integrated assaults. It was also the memory, preserved in books, interviews, and quiet conversations, of a young Marine who, at 9 o'clock on a humid morning in May 1945, stood up under fire with 30 kilograms of fuel on his back and turned what everyone called suicide gear into the key that unlocked a fortified ridge. One bunker, then another, then a fourth, all in 11 relentless minutes.